Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Romesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
Mould. It's bad for your health and it's bad for the property. And attitudes towards mould are changing. At the back end of 2022, we certainly saw an increase in the number of properties affected by mould. And so while it now may only be June, we are going to unapologetically talk about mould. Okay, Romesh, so let's get started. Mould. One of the things that I hear when I report this to landlords, one of the most frequent things that I hear is, well, we've never had any mould before, so it's got to be down to the tenant. What are they doing in my property? Is that fair?
No, it's a simple answer. That was a default position for the last 20, 30 years to blame tenants. And it's not acceptable to do that anymore because basically immediately blaming a tenant for lifestyle, I don't think you can do that. There was a high-profile case in December 20 where a poor little toddler died, baby Awab Ishak. The coroner said this child was exposed to mould over a prolonged period, and that was the cause of death. So that's had massive implications, ramifications on the social housing sector. So the Ombudsman basically investigated and said that local authorities and housing associations must be proactive and reactive. They cannot just rely on its lifestyle and it's the tenant's fault, basically. So you've got to investigate. So just some stats about mould to put it into perspective. 20% of tenants in the private rental sector are suffering from mould, damp or condensation these days. So simple answer is no, Rachel.
Yeah, I like the way you use the term lifestyle because I think lifestyle is one of the terms that they've actually said can't be used anymore or shouldn't be used anymore because this is nobody's lifestyle. However, I would argue that yes, while there are, increasing number of people suffering from mould, condensation and damp, 9 times out of 10, it is condensation that's causing the issue. And 9 times out of 10, that condensation is as a direct result of something that's going on in the property. So I understand why perceptions have had to change. I understand the causes of that. And I understand that we need to effectively deal with mould as landlords and agents. But at the same time, I think most landlords will be sitting there thinking, yes, I understand perceptions from above have changed. But 9 times out of 10, it's because of something my tenant is doing in my property.
Okay, now, I hear what you're saying, Rachel, but let's look at it another way. I'm going to ask you the question now. So if you do have a tenant, what should you do if they report damp?
So I think as always, but more so now than before, you need to investigate. So you can't just take the default position. No, it's down to you. Here's a mould guide. Carry on and, sort things out. You have to actually investigate. And my understanding is that they're introducing something called Awab's Law. I could be slightly wrong about the name, but right. I think it's okay. So Awab's Law, and that's giving people, and it's just aimed, I think, at the moment at councils and housing associations. Say you've got this amount of time to investigate the issue and this amount of time to actually address the issue before it then becomes a problem. So if somebody comes to you and says, I have mould, hopefully you will have identified it before. And I know we're going to talk about preempting these things later, but let's say, okay, you haven't been successful in stopping the mould from occurring, The minute you see it, you need to start investigating it. The minute the tenant reports it, you need to investigate. There are several ways you can do that. So there are things that you can do to say, okay, I notice things that you're doing around the property that maybe you can change. Give them the damp and mold guide. But there are things like surveys that you can organise to do a real in-depth investigation. Get a third-party independent person who's actually trained on these things to investigate what's going on in that property and investigate all of the causes of the problem. That's probably what I would do to start with.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think you're absolutely right. The investigation bit is key, and obviously home visit is critical to that to establish. And I would also say, adding to that, you've got to, once you've established, you've done some investigation in that property to assess how they're living, what they're doing, and if there's anything they can do, as you said earlier, to improve things. But also, do they have extractor fans? Is their heating working correctly? Do they have means of, in terms of drying clothes, are they able to dry them externally, or must they do it within the property? So it's all about, I guess, the moisture creation and removal and ventilation and heating aspects. You've got to examine carefully, really.
I think that's the important bit, because even if there are things that the tenant is doing incorrectly in a property, the landlord needs to be seen to address everything structural that is an issue with the property, but also to put things in place that enable any tenant to live in that property, regardless of lifestyle, without this becoming an issue. So the thing I read recently was you can't advise people to dry their clothes outside if they don't have any outside space to dry things in. You have to allow for the fact that, yes, in this studio flat that's on the second floor, they're going to need to dry clothes internally. And so how do you deal with that? So yes, all the extractor fans and trickle vents and all that sort of thing comes into it. And yes, is the heating sufficient? So, but what would you do if it is... Oh, you have more to say on that?
No, sorry. No,
okay.
no, I didn't.
I was going to say,
you carry on.
What would you say if you did find what would you do if you did find a structural issue?
If you find a structural issue, I think you have to get a surveyor, a competent surveyor in to investigate and advise on a course of action to resolve that, because a structural issue is the responsibility of the landlord. There's no getting away from that, and you've got to tackle and deal with that. And I think the safest way to do that is using a surveyor, because then if there were issues further down the line, you can evidence the fact that you have taken professional, competent advice from a third party, and it's not just you've taken a view, said, "Oh, I think it's this," and had a stab at sort of guesswork. Also, if the situation were ever to go down a legal route, or somebody to make a more formal complaint, then you've got evidence to show in that process that you've acted diligently. Is what I would say. Do you think that's covered it, Rachel?
I think I would kind of agree. The only thing that I would say is that, I've spoken to a couple of landlords, and because there was a big increase in 2022, at the end of 22, because of the heating issues that we have, in terms of the price of energy, we therefore got more instances of mould. And speaking to a few landlords and saying, okay, look, we've advised the tenants about what to do inside. We know that there are issues with putting the heating on. We recommend getting a survey. Getting a survey. And then there's this tendency, or you have two options, let's say, of survey. So you will have the people who come around and they have a product to sell at the end of the day as well. So there are people who do all sorts of fancy fans and things like that, and they have a product to sell, and they will offer you a free survey. And then you have the surveys that you actually have to pay for. And if you're having to pay about £400, let's say, for a survey, for some people that can be almost half of the rent that they're getting. In this area, okay, it's not half of the rent, but, it's a fair chunk of the rent that you could be paying for a survey, when, as a landlord, you're sitting there saying, well, I know there were no issues before. I'm pretty convinced that my property is in decent condition. I'm not getting any reports from my letting agent that there's an issue with the condition. Therefore, why am I having to spend £400 on a survey to tell me that actually this is the tenant's issue and they're not living in this property as they should do? So that becomes a bit of an issue. And then there are times when some of the structural stuff is going to be expensive. And so, how do you do that if you can't actually afford that, but that's what's come back on the survey? What do you do at that point?
Good questions, Rachel. On the first point you made about those sort of companies that produce products and they do free surveys, I would say be wary in terms of there is potentially an agenda there. So that's why I sort of suggested a competent surveyor, an independent, maybe I should have used the word independent survey.
No, I agree with you. But I'm just saying there is a tendency sometimes from landlords to think, okay, where can I get a free survey? Well, you can get a free survey here, but it's actually not worth doing because they're more than likely going to recommend that you have some fancy gadget installed. But then they have to then go the other route and say, okay, well, I'm going to have to pay £400 for this. And that doesn't strike me as fair when you're telling me that there's washing hanging up in here. So,
well, I mean, you're right. Just the point to add is that if a landlord says, well, I'll take the free survey. And if the free survey says you need to improve the ventilation and put a positive ventilation air change system in, then you've asked for the free survey and you've got the results. Then you need to think about, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to act on that and go with it? Or are you going to then get an independent survey? Because those are your two options. You either do it.
Exactly. No, I agree. I'm just from a landlord's point of view, it's a bitter one to swallow when you think that 9 times out of 10, it's down to the tenant. And yet you're not allowed, if it's down to the not lifestyle, but if it's down to how someone's living inside the property, 9 times out of 10, and then to be able to not have to spend thousands on structural stuff, you then have to have a survey done at X amount of cost to yourself. So it is, I guess I'm just highlighting the change in the ways of thinking, the changes that landlords are going to have to recognise. It's not just as simple as saying, you can't say that it's down to the tenant. It's not just as simple as identifying that the tenant is doing something in the property that is not ideal and that is causing moisture and causing condensation and then causing mould. Yeah. It is actually going to cost landlords more, all of this.
No, absolutely, Rachel, you're right. It will, and it is a problem. It's a bitter pill to swallow.
It's a bitter pill to swallow. That's where we're going. Yes, it is. But let's say you've had your survey and it's not highlighted any major structural issues, or maybe it's identified that you need to change the extractor fan in the bathroom, or you need to improve the cooker hood that you've got, or change the filter or something. But the majority of the issue is identified to be the fact that windows aren't opened enough, or the heating isn't on enough, or there are clothes drying inside. What do you do then? What as a landlord should I be doing then?
Well, so really what you're saying, Rachel, is what if it's a tenant issue, I guess, is the question here.
Absolutely.
I would say you've got to work together with the tenant, because you're in there together. You've got a contract and you've got a business relationship. So you've got to work together. I think you've got to help them in terms of educating them, not blaming them, and encouraging them to change and improve some of their lifestyle stroke habits. So that could be checking and ensuring that they're heating the property correctly, making sure that they're ventilating, using trickle vents, opening windows, drying clothes in a way that's going to not cause potential mold in the property, using extractor fans. I think you've got to be collaborative with your tenant. I mean, we've got a situation with a tenant in Edmonton in North London, and here we've had to take a few measures in terms of improving loft insulation, extraction to that property to reduce the mold that's being created. We've done all of those measures and investigated. Then we've got to a situation where now the tenant's in a 1-bedroom flat and there's a woman and 2 children, young children, and she's not heating the property properly, because we've been there and we've asked her, in a quite sort of unaccusatory way, do you use the heating? How do you use it, etc. And it's sort of clear that she's not, and also drying clothes. So all of these things are creating a problem. We've asked the local authority in this particular case, can you move this family, because they're overcrowded and they're struggling to cope in this small flat. They haven't moved them. So we're stuck with this family who are still continuing to create mold. And that's one of the problems. So we're only trying to manage that situation now. And it looks like it's our fault, but I don't think it is, because we've done all we can in this particular case. So it is one of the problems where you've got tenants and they're not able to move.
And I think there are times. I was just going to say, there are times when it's... Are we buffering? I think I'm going to say this one. So there are times, I think, when it is, and it's because of something that's happening inside the property. So just to reverse it ever so slightly, so not to say it's the new person that moved in, but we have a property in Boreham Wood, and we took over this property from somebody else, and it had a tenant in it. It had tenants in it. So it's a lady and 3 children in a 2-bedroom property, 2-bedroom flat. And I've never seen mould like it. It really was quite something. It's one of those ones where you walk in and you think, why have I agreed to take this? What was I thinking? But they had 1 bedroom that was just black. And this lady's sons were sleeping in here. And so the first thing we did was we've got to get rid of all this mould. So we had everything professionally removed. And then we tried to identify what was going on. And it was the usual things of not using any heating, not opening any windows, drying clothes inside. It was, and plus having just a lot of stuff. You have 4 people in a 2-bedroom flat. It's a lot of stuff there. And they eventually moved out. They were, I think, rehoused by the council, if I remember rightly. But they moved out of their own accord while we were trying to deal with these things. We then had the flat completely redone in terms of removing mould from everywhere, cleaning everything. And we had everything inspected. And it turned out that there were heaters in a couple of rooms that just weren't working. But because they never turned their heating on, they didn't know that those heaters weren't working. So it was sort of, this property had no chance. It was always going to have condensation of mould. If you've got a large single bedroom with 2 adult sons living in it, no heating, but lots of stuff, it's going to get that kind of condensation and mould that causes problems. Because the new tenant moved in, no problems whatsoever. Single lady, child, no problems at all. But if you flip that around, and it was now, we'd have had to go down the whole route of surveys. Yes, the heaters would have had to be addressed, obviously. But if they're not using the heaters anyway, it's still going to cause a problem. So this is the bit that causes me a little bit of concern, because I think, well, what is it that landlord could then do to sort that problem out? But that's a detailed and specific one. So sorry, but it was just kind of just highlighting that actually it's not... Gone.
I was just going to add, Rachel, also that I think fuel poverty, because your example, I mean, it could be related to fuel poverty. I think fuel poverty is an issue because these days, with the current cost of living crisis, tenants are struggling to heat properties correctly and on a consistent sort of basis, so at a lowish temperature, which is the kind of general advice. So the only other things I would add is, if it is a tenant issue, potentially check and see if there's fuel poverty issues and if there's any organisations you could refer that tenant to. Also, I would say to do regular visits to inspect, to keep an eye on the situation, because if they haven't told you about the heating not working in that property, are they going to tell you again about a build-up of mould once you've had it all cleaned down? So that, I'd say, in those situations, it's really prudent to do regular visits and inspections so you can assess what's going on and why that's possibly going on.
I agree, and to actually see it. So I would be surprised if there are people who don't know that there was mould in their properties at the end of 22, and who are going to be even more surprised in 2023, because let's face it, if my maths is right, it's actually going to be more expensive this winter, because we won't be getting any money back from anyone. So although the bills are, I think, dropping slightly, it's still going to be more expensive for the average person this year. And after we've already had a year of it being expensive. So I think if you have, and that's another reason for doing this now in June, is if you haven't seen your property in a while, go see it now. And if you are going to have a survey done at any time and it highlights structural issues, because there can be structural issues that you don't know about. We've had that recently, where it turned out that some of the pointing on a property had gone. and so basically needed to be replaced because that was letting water through. So it can be that there are things like that that you don't know about and that have just happened over time. So it's not because the previous tenant was great and the current tenant is not great. It's just that things have changed over time. So things like that, if you're going to get those done, get them done now. Get them done in June, July, August, rather than waiting until it's cold and wet and miserable, when every roofer is going to be ridiculously busy and is going to book dates that they then have to cancel because it's snowing or it's wet or whatever. So it's another good reason for talking about it now, is if you have to do something, it'll be cheaper and they'll be more available.
Okay, good. No, I agree. So, Rachel, I think this is one where you could sort of comment on more and better than I. If I'm the landlord and I've got this situation with mould and the tenant's vacated, am I going to be able to claim against their deposit when they vacate for the damage caused by the mould and condensation?
I think this is one that I'd like to come back to maybe after we've spoken to somebody from one of the deposit schemes. Maybe we can get them on. Can you claim against a deposit? I've only had one experience of trying to claim against a deposit, and we were trying to claim for contribution to survey and mould removal. And that was on the back of 2 surveys and 2 cleanings of the property in terms of the mould. And it was a resounding disaster, I'd have to say. And everything that I read in the report back from the deposit company was basically saying, yes, there are things that the tenant is doing that are contributing to this, or yes, we can see that the surveyor has highlighted XYZ in terms of what we would previously have called lifestyle. But as it wasn't the only cause of the issues, they therefore sided with the tenant. So that was an extremely bitter pill to swallow. So there were a couple of what they call structural issues. But yes, things like drying clothes inside of a very large quantity, not opening windows, not heating the property apart from intermittently, didn't count at all. So yes, I'd say that landlords do have to be very careful. You can't just assume that because your tenant cluttered a property or because that they weren't heating it and they weren't ventilating it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to claim for this at the end of the tenancy. So I do think at a later date, it would be good to get someone on from the deposit schemes. I think they are very much like everybody else, just very much concerned. There's a change in perceptions, and there is much more responsibility being given to the landlord for these things, probably quite rightly so in many cases. But it is the line about this is not the only cause of was just wow. So even being seen to contribute to something doesn't make a difference. That's incredible. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that was the answer you wanted, but it's the only time I've ever had to claim. It's the only time I've ever had to claim, and it's going to make me very wary going forwards about how we approach this. But it, like you said in your example about becoming overcrowded, if you do become overcrowded, and we've had, I think, a lady and one child who, at the point of leaving this 2-bedroom property, became 2 adults, 3 children, and another one on the way. If you're in that situation and your tenant has made themselves intentionally overcrowded, I don't think the council automatically rehouse. And then you are quite likely going to have an issue inside the property that, what can you do about it as a landlord?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. So, another good, interesting question, which we often get asked by landlords, and I'm sure you do. What happens if the council get involved? Now, this is a really, really tricky one because I've experienced councils getting involved where you've got mould and damp, and they seem to, once they get involved, they write letters to you as the agent or you as the landlord as though you are guilty and the problem is all about the landlord and the landlord must fix this, basically. They have a certain way of writing letters. I'm sure you may have seen or come across over time.
Never
as well,
seen a
Rachel.
council letter, never seen it.
Well, you're very fortunate. That's all I can say. But we've had those in the past, and it's you kind of look, you read this letter, and you're like, okay, so it's all the landlord's fault and all the agent's fault, and they've got to resolve everything, and so it's very accusatory. But all I can say is, when you do get those letters, you need to be responsive, and you need to then respond and demonstrate what action you've taken. Whether it's a survey, whether it's a visit, whether it's feedback from the tenant, or whether they've said to you they don't heat it or they're overcrowded, and you need to present your case and response, because some of it will be potentially caused and contributed by a tenant. And some of it may well be issues with the property that need resolving and improving to reduce that. So it is scary when the council get involved, because it's almost as though like, well, you're guilty, you've got to fix it. That's the only advice I can give really on that point. Just be responsive and reactive very, very promptly.
Yeah, I'd say it depends on whether the council have actually been out or not. If they haven't seen your property, then they may just be sending you a letter and saying, oh, we understand this is an issue, blah, 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 do something. Yes, it's your fault. It's definitely your fault and you are a bad person and get it done. So yes, there is that. Yeah. But then also, I think because of the issues, they are, when they hear damp and mould, those cases or those calls from tenants are being prioritised. Okay, so I think there were stats from Haringey Council where they are basically prioritising mould and damp issues, and they have a big section on their website as to exactly why they're doing that. And their inspections in terms of selective licences and HMO licences, I think, are 100%, even though they haven't made anywhere near the inroads into it that they need to. So I think selective, they've only visited 1,200 of them or something. But they are prioritising those mould issues. So if they come out because someone's reported something, then you will get a letter, and that letter will say you have X amount of time to do this and X amount of time to do that. And so you need to jump on it. And I think that will get worse when they have, or the timescales will get shorter when you have Awab's law in place, if it comes into the private sector. But I think, just very quickly, one of the other things that I think a lot of landlords are quite upset about is that the majority of issues that we hear about are actually from social housing in some form or another. So even, Baby Awab, that was a social housing situation. Completely unacceptable, but it's a social housing situation. If you look at, or if you read the press recently around here, there are 3 blocks, I think, in the east of the borough. So the Shires and one other that I can't remember the name of, the 2 Shires ones, where they're rehousing people because of damp and mould, or condensation and mould, but basically mould in these properties. And because they'd had to turn the gas off and things like that, it's like there's no effective heating, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. And so that's a huge number of people who are having to be moved and who are currently living in and lived last winter in unacceptable conditions. So it is a little bit galling sometimes for landlords to think, hang on, why is everyone hitting the private rental sector when actually it would appear that the majority of issues are in social housing?
No, I agree. You're right. It feels like the private rental sector is being tarnished, by association, but which isn't really fair. But Rachel, I wanted to ask you something else now, related. So I'm a landlord. How am I going to preempt these problems?
Well, you asked me a while ago, I think in our second episode, about whether I ever visit tenants at home before they become our tenants. So before we accept their application, have I visited them at home? And there is a little part of me that's thinking, actually, maybe that is more required. Or, maybe send me pictures of your home or something. I don't know. But that aside, how do you preempt it? Well, number one thing we always do is to send out a damp and mould guide. So maybe send that out, but instead of sending it, actually go through it with the tenant on move-in day. This is how you need to do things. I think showing people how the boiler works and how to adjust the temperature on the boiler, the time on timer, and to use the individual thermostats on radiators, I think that's kind of crucial. Reminding people just before it gets to winter time how to do these things, show them on the previous inspection how to actually use things again. And if you're doing regular visits, which you should be doing, you should be able to spot little lifestyle things that might be an issue. See, I've just used the term lifestyle again, but, things they're doing that might be an issue. And it's always worth also having contractors, talking to contractors after they've been round to a property, because people will tidy up an awful lot for an estate agent or for the landlord, but they're perhaps a little bit more casual when a contractor goes around. So catch up with the contractor after a maintenance visit and just say, hey, how did everything look? Was it clean, tidy? Was there washing hanging on the radiators? Was there any condensation on the windows? Blah, 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 blah. So our contractors are quite used to us asking those questions. So they automatically come back and feedback to us after those kinds of visits. But then also, I think, as you said, we have to be sensitive about if there are issues with, can't remember the term you used, but if there are financial issues, and is somebody going to be able... That's it, fuel poverty. Are people actually going to be able to heat their property adequately? I think those sorts of things you need to be aware of so that you can potentially help the tenant going forward. Yeah.
I was just going to add, Rachel, that obviously what we try to do is pre-letting. We always check all our extractor fans are all working correctly as they should, and obviously heating as well. But I recently had a case where I met a landlord, and it was a new property that we took on, and she was very, very honest with me as a new agent, and she said, we always get a little bit of damp and mold and condensation on this wall in this bedroom. And I was like, oh, okay, thanks for telling me, this is really helpful. And then when we talked about it further, she said, can we put some air bricks in? And I said, air bricks aren't really the solution, because we're just going to create more cold air coming into the property. And basically tenants are going to end up blocking those because they're going to feel the cold, and it's fuel poverty, and they're going to end up paying for that. So what we suggested in this case, and what we've done in a number of properties over time, is we dry line that particular external wall. So we put a new plasterboard with polystyrene backing on it. So that was fitted to that wall and then skimmed and repainted. It then meant that cold wall was no longer a cold wall. So you didn't have that warm air hitting that cold solid brick wall and forming molding and condensating on that wall. So I was so pleased that landlord shared that with me and was honest. And so we were able to, I think, preempt, because we haven't had an incident since then in that property. We were able to preempt that problem, which sometimes, reflecting on your previous tenancies is really important going forward. That was all I was going to add, really.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. And I think also there are some basics that where attitudes have changed a little bit. So previously you would have people say, I don't need to have an extractor fan in the bathroom. There's a window. Yeah, it's not the same thing.
Yes.
It's not the same thing at all. And also having, fans that are linked to the light. So it comes on automatically with the light, things like that. So there are little things that can be done like that. I'm a bit scared of the price of dry lining a wall. I don't know how much that is. Yeah, but that for some people that would be prohibitive. But little things like linking your extractor fan to the light, so you don't have to rely on the tenant turning it on. Important. Or even humidistats. And I know we'll come on to the detail of all this stuff in another episode, but there are lots of things that you can do that are relatively cheap as a landlord that would, not that your home is necessarily automatically going to have condensation, but where that change in tenant could mean that actually if they don't do things a certain way, there's going to be that kind of thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, I was going to ask another question, Rachel. What is going to happen when the Renters Reform Act becomes law and Section 21 is abolished? How are you going to deal with these kind of situations, and what's the impact there?
I think the abolishing Section 21 for most things, I don't think matters that much, so long as they firm up Section 8 excuse me, and make that easier. However, when you come to things like this, I think it is going to be much harder, particularly when people are very sensitive about blaming tenants for mould. So in the situation I've had with that deposit, those tenants ultimately left, you wouldn't be able to serve Section 21 on them, obviously. You wouldn't be able to Section 8 them because obviously if the DPS is saying that, that it's not the only cause of, therefore. So I don't know. This and possibly, the standard heavy tenant type issue is where I find it slightly difficult. And I don't know. Those for me are the ones that are going to cause landlords real problems. The ones where, it's harder to prove that something is entirely down to the tenant. So I don't know. Doom and gloom on that one. I wait and see what happens. I'm conscious that every time I speak today, it's all about bad stuff. So I don't really know. I think it comes down to tenant selection again. So this is where I say maybe it will be a case of going and visiting somebody beforehand and seeing exactly how they're living. Are they hoarders? Do they have walls that are just completely boxes up against them? Do they have 3,000 pairs of shoes everywhere? How are they living at this moment? Because if they're taking that to your property, that's a problem. Yeah. I think we'll have more of the tenant selection in terms of, I don't want more than 2 adults and 1 child in this 2-bedroom property. Yes, you could get bunk beds in there. Yes, you could probably get a second bed in there, but you might also have another child. And then we're going to get. So I think there'll be a lot more focus on tenant selection and also on inspections to be able to catch things as soon as they start to present as an issue.
Sure.
What do you think?
Rachel, I'm conscious of time.
So you get to dodge that little bullet there.
Well, no, I'm happy to answer that. I think it's going to create a problem for landlords, as you said, because sometimes there are cases where you just think that the tenant is largely contributing to a problem, and especially if they have issues with fuel poverty and they're not heating that property, and there's this insane amounts of mould and condensation, then you're stuck. And I think abolishing Section 21 would create a problem for those landlords because you then have to blame that tenant and cite a specific reason. And I think it's the proof is in the pudding. We won't know how it's going to pan out, but I definitely think it's going to be an issue and a problem for landlords.
However,
a small minority. Yeah.
However, soon after, if the timelines go as the timelines are supposed to go, so let's say that we have the renters reform in next year sometime, so 2024, if everything else goes according to plan and we have the EPC upgrade changes for 2025, do you think that will lessen the impact of the Section 21 changes? What do you think about the EPC potential change impact? So this is where EPCs are potentially going to need to be a minimum of a C for new tenancies, and then 2028 for existing ones.
Well, I mean, I'm going to give a short answer because I'm just conscious of time today. But I would say that on paper and in theory, if properties are improved to a C grade, we should see a reduction in mould and condensation. However, there is a danger of over-insulating properties, and then that brings itself another problem. So I'm going to sit on the fence a little bit and say, in theory, it should improve, but there's so many other factors that intertwine with this as well. It's not a simple.
Yeah,
answer,
I'm with you.
I
think in theory it should improve things, but I think we're then in danger of having a completely sealed box. So there's none of the 1930s drafts that you would get to ensure that there is some kind of ventilation. And so, is that then going to cause a problem? But we will wait and see. We'll wait and see on the dates, and we'll wait and see on whether these things do make a difference. So, just taking your lead on time, if I was to ask you for a summary that you would give landlords in terms of what to do with mould or what they should be thinking about in terms of mould in their property. And now, what would it be?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to do it. I'm going to try my best to do really, really brief and quick here. I would say you've got to listen to what's being reported and you've got to investigate. No matter what you think, you have to go through the motions of investigating because you may discover something that you didn't expect or anticipate. So investigate, check out the claims and visit and have a look and see and if you can identify or call in an expert, a professional to assist you to identify why you're having a situation with mold and damp, despite what's gone on before, whether you've had problems there or not. Park that and just investigate. And that investigation will throw up different things. It may lead you to the conclusion you thought, but it may not. So just go into it with open eyes and an open mind, I would say, is the biggest thing. And that's the emphasis. And that is the whole ethos now that we all have to do, I think.
Okay.
And that's it.
Just looking at my summary and where you've gone nice and open and nice and open and understanding, I'm a bit more cover yourself. So my summary is very much on the, excuse me, communication, making sure that your communication with your tenant is open, excuse me, making sure your communication is open, honest, free, etc. And also making sure that a lot of that communication, where necessary, is in writing to show that you can demonstrate it later. I would say make sure you have a fabulous inventory done at the beginning to, excuse me, to show the condition of the property and to see little things like there's no mold along the windows and that sort of thing. So I'd have a good inventory. I would do regular inspections. So again, with the communication to make sure that you're talking to the tenant and that you spot any potential issues early so that you can deal with them together. And then I would say pray that things work out fabulously in terms of EPCs and, that, you can claim money back from your deposit and that the council don't nail you to a wall. I'm a bit bitter and twisted, I'm afraid. So, yes, that would be my summary. But we will talk about the specific details later, won't we?
We will. And I think we could look at some of the technical stuff and products out there on the market, which, one could use. So on that note, I think, it's been a good episode and I think it's time to say goodbye.
Goodbye. If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.